The year was 1308, and the Kingdom of England was on the brink of significant change. On the surface, England seemed a prosperous and mighty nation, but beneath the crown's gleam and the royal banners fluttering in the wind, turmoil brewed. The aging King Edward I, known as Longshanks for his towering stature and formidable rule, had recently passed away, leaving his son, Edward II, to take the throne. However, Edward II's reign was anything but smooth. His ascension to the throne was marred by challenges from the very start. Most notably his lack of experience and political acumen. Edward II's personality stood in stark contrast to his father's. While Edward I had been a military leader of great renown, earning victory after victory in Scotland and establishing England as a force to be reckoned with, Edward II seemed ill-equipped to carry on his father's legacy. His reign was marked by a series of political missteps, and most notably, his inability to assert control over his nobles and military leaders. His failure to lead with strength and decisiveness soon created fractures in the kingdom, making him vulnerable to both external and internal pressures. As England grappled with an uncertain future, one of the most politically significant events of the early 14th century took place: Edward II's marriage to Isabella of France. This union was far more than a simple marriage of two individuals. It was a carefully orchestrated political alliance between two of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, England and France. Isabella, a princess of remarkable beauty and intelligence, was the daughter of King Philip IV of France, one of the most powerful monarchs of the time. She was sent to England to secure peace between the two nations and to strengthen the ties between the royal families. Isabella's journey to England was not one she chose for herself, but rather a duty bestowed upon her by her father, King Philip IV. Isabella had been born into a world where royal marriages were often seen as instruments of diplomacy and power. From an early age, she had been groomed to fulfill this very role. As the daughter of Philip IV, she was caught in the complex web of European politics. Her marriage to Edward II was designed to secure a bond between the French and English crowns, ensuring that the turbulent relationship between the two nations would be momentarily soothed. The match, while politically necessary, was far from romantic. Isabella was only 12 years old when she first arrived in England, and Edward II was a young king still finding his footing. The two were not strangers to each other. They had met during Isabella's childhood visits to the English court. But the nature of their relationship was far from the passionate love stories often told in royal courts. Isabella's primary role was to secure England's position as an ally to France, and Edward's role was to maintain that alliance, albeit with the heavy pressure of his monarchy's challenges. Their marriage took place in January 1308, when Isabella was just 12 years old, and Edward II was 23. The ceremony, while undoubtedly grand, held little true meaning for the couple. Their union was primarily an agreement between their fathers, and both Edward and Isabella had little say in the matter. For Isabella, the marriage was an opportunity to solidify France's position in Europe, while for Edward II, it was a necessary step in securing peace with his powerful neighbor. However, from the outset, the union between Edward and Isabella was fraught with difficulty. Isabella, a proud and intelligent princess, quickly found herself disappointed with her new husband. Edward II's inability to assert control over his kingdom, his preference for the company of his male favorites, and his lack of experience in matters of statecraft did not sit well with Isabella. She had expected a strong and decisive king by her side, but what she found instead was a man whose reign was slowly slipping into chaos. Though their marriage was meant to foster peace between England and France, it did not take long for Isabella to realize that Edward II's leadership was not as stable as it appeared. His failures in the field of war, particularly his inability to defeat the Scots, and his weak leadership in domestic affairs created unrest within England. By the time Edward II ascended to the throne, tensions with his nobles were already high. These early years of his reign were marked by unrest, and Isabella was often left to navigate the treacherous waters of English politics with little help from her husband. Isabella's role in the English court became more complicated as she faced an ever-growing disillusionment with Edward II's rule. The failure of the king to provide the stability and strength that was expected from the English crown led to increasing resentment not only from the nobles but also from his queen. Isabella was not content to simply sit idly by and observe her husband's failures. As the years passed, her frustration grew, and she found herself drawn to others who shared her dissatisfaction with Edward II. While Isabella's marriage to Edward II was initially meant to strengthen the ties between England and France, it soon became clear that the Queen would have to play a much more active role in securing her own future and that of her children. The tension between Isabella and Edward II would ultimately shape the course of English history in ways that neither of them could have imagined when they first married. Isabella's beauty and intellect would prove to be powerful tools in navigating the political landscape. But it was her political acumen and her ability to form alliances that would ultimately change the course of her life, and that of her son, Edward III. Though the early years of Isabella's marriage to Edward II were marked by a lack of true companionship, her influence over the events that followed would prove to be profound. As the years passed, the young queen's role in the kingdom would become far more significant, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would follow in the years to come. The initial hope for peace between England and France, symbolized by the union of Isabella and Edward, would give way to political intrigue, rebellion, and a mother's fierce determination to secure her son's future. The marriage of Isabella and Edward II, while initially seen as a diplomatic necessity, would become a crucible for both the royal couple and the English kingdom itself. What began as a political alliance would evolve into a struggle for power, with Isabella emerging as one of the most significant and influential figures of her time. Her journey from a young, dutiful wife to a powerful queen with her own agenda would set the stage for the events that would ultimately shape the reign of her son, Edward III, and change the course of English history forever. As the years passed, the cracks in the marriage between Isabella of France and Edward II grew wider. What had begun as a political alliance soon became a battleground of frustration, disillusionment, and unspoken resentment. Despite Isabella's high-born status and her noble position as queen, she found herself trapped in a marriage that promised little more than disappointment. The first years of their union, though cordial on the surface, revealed deep flaws in Edward II's rule, flaws that Isabella would soon find impossible to ignore. Edward II had inherited the throne at a time of intense pressure. His father, Edward I, had been a legendary warrior king, fiercely respected both in England and abroad. Edward II, however, lacked his father's military genius, diplomatic skills, and ability to maintain control over his kingdom. From the outset of his reign, Edward's indecisiveness and his preference for the company of his male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, caused a deep rift between the king and his nobles. The English court, rather than functioning as a stable foundation of power, became a place of intrigue and infighting. Isabella, raised in the royal courts of France, had been taught to expect strong leadership from her king. She had come to England with high hopes for her marriage, believing that it would offer her a position of influence and respect. But instead, she found herself in a kingdom where her husband appeared weak, indecisive, and easily manipulated by those around him. Edward's constant favoritism toward Gaveston, a man whom many of the English nobility despised, only deepened Isabella's frustration. Gaveston was everything that Isabella's royal upbringing had taught her to despise: arrogant, flamboyant, and someone who seemed to enjoy the power and attention of the English court without ever being held accountable for his actions. As time went on, the growing tension between Edward II and his nobles became harder for Isabella to ignore. The English monarchy, which had once been a symbol of strength, was now seen by many as a laughingstock. Edward's failure to control his court, combined with his military blunders, created an unstable environment that left the kingdom vulnerable to external and internal threats. Isabella, who had initially tried to remain a dutiful wife, found herself increasingly drawn into the political turmoil of the time. The breakdown in Isabella's marriage was not just a personal struggle, it was a political one. The Queen, already a politically savvy individual, began to recognize that she could not remain passive in the face of Edward II's failures. She began to seek out alliances with those who were similarly dissatisfied with her husband's reign. One of these figures was Roger Mortimer, a powerful English nobleman who had been imprisoned by Edward II for his own perceived disloyalty. Mortimer, like many others, resented the king's weakness and favoritism toward those like Gaveston, whom he saw as a threat to the stability of the realm. Roger Mortimer, like Isabella, was a skilled politician, and the two soon became allies. Their shared discontent with Edward II laid the groundwork for what would ultimately become a rebellion. Mortimer's presence in Isabella's life brought a new energy to her actions. The Queen, who had once been a figurehead of England's royal court, now found herself at the center of a growing political movement, one that aimed to wrest control of the kingdom from her husband. Isabella, through her relationship with Mortimer, began to realize the power she could wield, not just as a queen, but as a woman with the ability to shape the future of her kingdom. The relationship between Isabella and Mortimer grew stronger as the political situation in England deteriorated. They both recognized that Edward II's reign was on the brink of collapse. The king's weakness had created an opening for those with ambition and desire for power. And Mortimer, ever the opportunist, began to strategize how he could use Isabella's position to advance his own agenda. Together, they began to make plans for a coup, a plan to overthrow Edward II and place Isabella's son, the young Edward III, on the throne. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France on a diplomatic mission, ostensibly to negotiate peace with her brother, King Charles IV of France. It was a trip that would have far-reaching consequences. While in France, Isabella's relationship with Mortimer continued to deepen, and the seeds of rebellion were sown. The Queen, whose frustration with her husband had reached its peak, began to recognize the possibility of using her son, Edward III, to secure her own future and the future of the kingdom. In Mortimer, she found an ally who could help her achieve these goals. During this time, Edward II, back in England, was largely absent from the decision-making process. His failure to govern effectively had left the kingdom in disarray, and the barons, who were growing increasingly dissatisfied with his rule, began to look for alternative leadership. Isabella and Mortimer's alliance, built on mutual ambition and a shared desire to see Edward II removed from power, was a dangerous game. They knew that they needed to move swiftly if they were to succeed in their plan. By 1326, the political situation in England had reached a tipping point. Isabella, with Mortimer's help, made the bold decision to return to England and take matters into her own hands. Her son, now a young man, was poised to take the throne, and Isabella's determination to secure his future became her driving force. With Mortimer at her side, Isabella raised an army and returned to England, where she would confront her husband and set in motion a series of events that would change the course of English history. Upon her return to England, Isabella and Mortimer quickly seized control of the country. Edward II, once the powerful King of England, found himself utterly defeated by the combined forces of his wife and Mortimer. The king was captured, and Isabella, after years of frustration and political maneuvering, had succeeded in her mission to overthrow her husband. Edward II was imprisoned, and a regency was established under Isabella's control, with Mortimer acting as the de facto ruler. Isabella's political victories, however, would come at a cost. The downfall of Edward II marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one in which she would wield unprecedented power. But this power came with its own set of challenges. The relationship between mother and son, which had begun with great promise, would soon become fraught with tension as Isabella and Mortimer's rule began to clash with Edward III's own sense of authority. Yet for a brief time, Isabella stood at the center of England's political stage, a queen who had succeeded in achieving what many thought impossible. The political landscape in England had shifted dramatically. Isabella, once a queen in a marriage fraught with disappointment, had now emerged as the central figure in a rebellion that would alter the course of her country's history. Her return to England in 1326, with Roger Mortimer at her side, had been nothing short of a declaration of war against her husband. Edward II, her son, Edward III, was now the figurehead of the movement, though it was Isabella and Mortimer who controlled the reins of power. Edward II, who had been once considered invincible as the King of England, was captured and imprisoned, his reign ending in disgrace. For Isabella, the overthrow of her husband was not merely a political victory, it was a personal triumph. The years of frustration, the years of enduring a marriage with a king she had never respected, had finally come to a head. She had succeeded where many others had failed. She had removed a king from his throne. And with Mortimer's help, She had secured the future of her son. But as often happens with power, it would come with its own set of complications. As the English kingdom shifted from the hands of Edward II to the control of Isabella and Mortimer, the pair began to consolidate their rule. Mortimer, who had once been a prisoner of Edward II, now stood as one of the most powerful men in England. His influence over Isabella grew stronger as their alliance flourished. Mortimer was not a man of honor or loyalty. He was a calculating opportunist who knew how to maneuver in the treacherous waters of the English court. He was ambitious, and he knew that Isabella's success was, in many ways, his own success. Together, they formed a dangerous duo, capable of ruling England with an iron fist. However, Mortimer's ambitions were not confined to merely assisting Isabella in her pursuit of power. He also had his sights set on something far greater, his own future. Isabella had been the catalyst for his rise, but Mortimer began to envision himself as the true ruler of England. The quiet manipulation of the young Edward III became Mortimer's most dangerous strategy. Though the king was technically in power, Mortimer was the one who held the levers of government. He became the de facto ruler, controlling the affairs of state while Edward III remained a figurehead. But for Isabella, the cost of her alliance with Mortimer began to weigh heavily on her heart. Despite the fact that her son was technically king, it was clear that Mortimer held more sway in the kingdom. And though Isabella had been the one to orchestrate her husband's downfall, she began to realize that Mortimer's ambitions might not align with her own. She had brought her son to power, and she had ensured that England was under control, but at what cost? The summer of 1327 would prove to be a turning point for both Isabella and Mortimer. The young king, Edward III, had grown more aware of the dynamics of the court and the realities of his position. The ambitious Mortimer had, for the time being, been able to secure his place in England's political structure. But Edward III's dissatisfaction was mounting. As a young king, Edward had been taught to be patient, to bide his time, but patience was running out. In the face of Mortimer's growing arrogance, the young Edward began to realize the depth of his mother's influence. He knew that Isabella's actions, while rooted in a desire to protect his future, had also placed him in a situation where he was increasingly overshadowed by Mortimer. Isabella may have been the queen who had liberated him from his father's reign, but it was Mortimer who held the power. In this realization, Edward began to understand the delicate balance between loyalty and ambition, and how easily that balance could tip. Though Isabella had been the driving force behind her husband's removal from the throne, the reality of ruling had proven more difficult than she had ever imagined. While Mortimer was a shrewd strategist, Isabella was increasingly uncomfortable with the growing control he exerted over both the kingdom and her son. The political situation became more complex with each passing day. The barons, who had once been loyal to Edward II, began to grow restless with the rule of Mortimer, and discontent in the kingdom began to rise. As the months passed, Edward III, once a pawn in the hands of his mother and Mortimer, began to take matters into his own hands. He realized that the time had come to reclaim his kingdom from the clutches of Mortimer, whose growing power had begun to alienate the very people who had supported Isabella's rise to power. The king, once a young boy forced into a role of powerlessness, had now matured into a man with his own desires and aspirations. His patience had been tested, but he knew that in order to truly rule England, he had to remove Mortimer from the picture. In 1330, after years of growing tension and frustration, Edward III took the first steps toward breaking free from the stranglehold of Mortimer and Isabella's regency. With the support of key figures in the court and the military, Edward orchestrated a coup that would change the course of his reign. Mortimer was captured and executed, and Isabella was forced into a life of exile, far from the throne she had once controlled so effectively. The coup was swift, brutal, and marked the end of Mortimer's influence on England. For Isabella, the fallout from the coup was devastating. She had fought for her son's throne, had risked everything to ensure his future, and yet, it was her very son who had betrayed her. Isabella's power was shattered, and the once powerful queen found herself relegated to the margins of history. She was forced to live in exile, stripped of the authority she had once wielded with such deftness. Though she remained a mother, her political influence was gone, and the young Edward III had emerged as the true ruler of England. The consequences of Isabella's actions were not easily forgotten. The regency she had ruled with Mortimer had been marked by ambition and cunning. But it had ultimately led to her downfall. In the end, Isabella was left to reflect on the choices she had made and the price of power. She had secured a future for her son, but in doing so, had lost much more than she had ever intended. The events that led to Edward II's downfall were nothing short of dramatic. Isabella's return to England in 1326 and her subsequent rebellion against her husband marked the beginning of the end for the ill-fated king. The monarchy, once a symbol of England's strength, was now crumbling under the weight of royal mismanagement, courtly intrigue, and the political machinations of both Isabella and her ambitious ally, Roger Mortimer. Edward II's reign had been plagued by numerous failures, but the most glaring of these was his inability to control his court. Especially the conflict with his own nobles. He had alienated the English barons with his favoritism towards certain individuals. Notably his close relationship with Piers Gaveston, whom many in the court viewed as a corrupting influence. Gaveston, a man of humble origins, was bestowed with titles and wealth far beyond his station. This caused widespread resentment among the English nobility, who felt that their king was more interested in pleasing his favorite than in governing the kingdom effectively. In addition to his courtly troubles, Edward II had failed to manage the ongoing conflicts with Scotland. His defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 had been a humiliating blow to the English crown and a catalyst for further discontent. The Scots, emboldened by their victory, continued to defy Edward's rule, while the king's own attempts to assert control were met with growing resistance from both his nobles and the people. By 1326, the political climate had reached a boiling point. Isabella, fed up with her husband's weakness and indecisiveness, had finally allied with Roger Mortimer, a man with his own grievances against Edward II. Mortimer, who had spent years in exile after being imprisoned by Edward II, had his own ambitions for power. Together, he and Isabella crafted a plan to remove Edward II from the throne and place their son, Edward III, in his stead. The coup was swift and decisive. Isabella and Mortimer, with the support of key English barons, marched into England and captured Edward II. The once proud king, now a prisoner in his own court, was quickly stripped of his crown. On January 20, 1327, Edward II was formally deposed, and his young son, Edward III, was crowned King of England. But the coronation of the new king was a hollow victory for Isabella and Mortimer. Though their son sat upon the throne, it was clear that they, not the young king, held the true power in the kingdom. Edward III, at just 14 years old, was a mere figurehead in the early years of his reign. It was Isabella and Mortimer who ruled in his name, making all the important decisions and controlling the direction of the kingdom. The coronation of Edward III marked the beginning of a regency that would ultimately prove to be fraught with tension and power struggles. Though Isabella had succeeded in securing the throne for her son, her position was not without its challenges. Mortimer, though a capable leader in his own right, was increasingly viewed with suspicion by the English nobility. His ambitions, once aligned with Isabella's, were beginning to cause discord. While Isabella had hoped to wield power as a queen regent, Mortimer's growing influence threatened to overshadow her. The once strong and capable woman found herself sidelined as Mortimer became the dominant figure in the kingdom, wielding control over both the throne and the affairs of state. As the months went by, the tensions between Isabella and Mortimer began to escalate. The queen, once the power behind the throne, found herself increasingly isolated from the decision-making processes in the kingdom. Mortimer, sensing that he could continue to manipulate the young king and maintain his grip on power, began to push Isabella aside. What had begun as a partnership between two ambitious individuals was slowly unraveling. Edward III, though young and inexperienced, was beginning to grow more aware of the power dynamics at play. As he watched Mortimer's increasing control over the kingdom, the young king began to understand the delicate balance of power in his court. Though he had once been a pawn in the hands of his mother and Mortimer, Edward III's growing dissatisfaction with their rule began to take root. The rift between Isabella and Mortimer reached its peak in 1330, when Edward III, now 18 years old, decided to take matters into his own hands. With the help of a small group of loyal supporters, the king orchestrated a dramatic coup to overthrow Mortimer. The coup was swift and efficient, and Mortimer was captured and imprisoned. His reign was brought to an abrupt end, and the young king, now free from Mortimer's influence, was able to assert his authority. Isabella, for her part, was devastated by her son's actions. The woman who had once been the driving force behind his ascent to the throne now found herself relegated to the sidelines. Mortimer, once her closest ally, had been the cause of her downfall. But while Isabella's political power had been shattered, she remained a mother. She was still the queen mother. And though her role in the kingdom had diminished, her influence over her son remained. Edward III's coup marked the beginning of a new chapter in his reign. No longer under the control of his mother and Mortimer, he was now free to chart his own course as king. Though Isabella and Mortimer had initially believed that they were securing the future of the kingdom by placing Edward III on the throne, they had failed to account for the growing independence of the young king. Edward III's reign, which had started under the shadow of his mother's regency, would soon become one of the most successful in English history. The coronation of Edward III, once seen as a mere formality, had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the young king's rise to power. As he grew older and more experienced, Edward III would go on to solidify his position as one of England's greatest monarchs, leaving behind a legacy of military victories, territorial expansion, and political strength. But for Isabella, the fall from power was a bitter pill to swallow. She had fought for her son's future, but in the end, it was his independence that secured both his reign and his legacy. The downfall of Edward II and the subsequent rise of Edward III marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Isabella's journey from a powerful queen regent to a mother in exile was a testament to the ever-changing nature of power in medieval England. The coronation of Edward III may have been a moment of triumph, but it also set the stage for a mother's eventual fall from grace, as her son took his place as the true king of England. After Edward II was deposed and Edward III was crowned king, the political atmosphere in England shifted dramatically. The young king's coronation in January 1327 marked the official beginning of a new era. But the reign of Edward III did not truly begin with the arrival of the new monarch on the throne. Instead, it started under the shadow of a regency. For the first few years of his reign, Edward III was not the one who held the reins of power. His mother, Isabella of France, and her ally, Roger Mortimer, were the ones who ruled in his name. Isabella, in the wake of her successful coup against Edward II, took control of the kingdom with Mortimer at her side, while the young king, still a boy of just 14, was officially crowned. It was Isabella's will and Mortimer's ambition that shaped the policies of the kingdom. The people of England had yet to witness the true potential of their young king, for he was not yet in a position to act independently. It was his mother, Isabella, who served as the figurehead of power, wielding authority with an iron grip, while Mortimer stood as the political strategist behind the scenes. The early years of Edward III's reign were marked by the uneasy coexistence of Isabella's desire to maintain her control and her growing realization that she could not continue to rule England indefinitely. She had come to England as a queen consort, a woman bound by the royal duties of her marriage to Edward II, and had risen to power by leading a rebellion against her husband. Now, as the mother of the king, she sought to secure her son's future. But despite her powerful position, Isabella faced numerous challenges. At first, the situation seemed stable. Isabella and Mortimer moved swiftly to secure the loyalty of the English nobility, cementing their rule with a blend of strategic alliances and force. Mortimer, with his sharp mind and political savvy, took the lead in overseeing England's military campaigns and managing its domestic affairs. Isabella, ever the queen, focused on the ceremonial aspects of kingship, offering guidance to her son and acting as the face of authority. The monarchy, once threatened by the collapse of Edward II's reign, seemed now to be firmly in the hands of the regents. Yet beneath the surface, the discontent that simmered during Edward II's rule began to rise again. Isabella's relationship with Mortimer, while initially one of mutual respect and shared ambition, began to show signs of strain. Mortimer, a man of tremendous ambition, did not intend to play second fiddle to the queen. He had been instrumental in securing her power, but he now sought to secure more for himself. As Mortimer grew more powerful, his influence over the young king, Edward III, became more pronounced. Edward, still a teenager, had not yet fully understood the weight of the crown or his own potential as a ruler. However, his frustration with Mortimer's overbearing control began to simmer, as the young king realized he was being kept in the background. In the early days of his reign, Edward III showed no overt signs of rebellion. As a boy, he had relied heavily on his mother and Mortimer for guidance. But the more he observed their methods of rule, the more the young king began to feel that he was being sidelined. Mortimer, despite his political skill, was increasingly viewed by many as a usurper who had manipulated both Isabella and the kingdom for his own gain. The people of England, especially the nobles, were beginning to grow restless once more. They longed for the return of a strong, decisive king, not a figurehead controlled by others. Isabella, too, was caught in a web of growing tensions. The delicate balance between her desire to hold on to power and the need to prepare her son for eventual independence created an inner conflict. While she had initially believed that ruling through her son would solidify her power and ensure the stability of the kingdom, she began to understand the limits of her position. She had been a queen in her own right, a force to be reckoned with, and now, as the mother of the king, she found herself in a position where her influence was being gradually eroded. The tension between Isabella and Mortimer grew over the years as Mortimer's ambitions continued to push the boundaries of their agreement. The young king, Edward III, was not blind to Mortimer's increasingly domineering actions. While he had been patient at first, Edward III was beginning to feel the weight of the crown pressing on him. He had grown from a boy into a young man who understood that, if he was to truly rule England, he would have to assert himself. He could no longer allow Mortimer to dictate the kingdom's future. It was during these years of rising tension that the young king began to gather the support he needed to take control of his own destiny. Edward III was not a boy given to recklessness. He was shrewd, calculating, and, when the time was right, he would show the world just how capable he was. But the decision to act against Mortimer and his mother would not come without consequence. It was a decision that would shape the future of the English monarchy and set the stage for the young king's eventual emergence as one of England's greatest rulers. The regency, though established with the intent to secure Edward III's future, was quickly unraveling. Isabella, once the queen who had successfully overthrown Edward II, found herself in a precarious position. Mortimer, once her trusted ally, had become a rival for the power she had fought so hard to claim. Edward III, who had been raised under the influence of both Isabella and Mortimer, was now ready to take control of his own kingdom. The conflict between mother and son, once a relationship built on shared ambition, was now one of political division. As the power struggle between Isabella, Mortimer, and Edward III grew more intense, the young king began to maneuver more strategically. By the year 1330, when Edward was 18 years old, the tensions that had been building for years finally reached their peak. The court was divided, and the nobles, sensing the changing tides, began to rally behind the young king. They had grown tired of Mortimer's rule, and their loyalty shifted in favor of the legitimate monarch, Edward III. Edward's rebellion against Mortimer was swift and decisive. With the help of a small group of trusted men, including some of the most influential figures in the kingdom, Edward III seized the opportunity to strike. Mortimer, once the powerful man who had controlled the throne through Isabella's regency, was captured. The coup that Edward III orchestrated was a turning point in English history, marking the end of Mortimer's influence and the beginning of Edward's reign as the true King of England. Isabella, meanwhile, found herself facing the consequences of her actions. The mother who had once been the driving force behind her son's ascent to the throne was now relegated to the periphery of the political scene. She had fought for her son's crown, but it was his rebellion against Mortimer that ultimately solidified his power. Isabella, though still the queen mother, was no longer the central figure in the kingdom. The young king had found his independence, and with it, he began to shape the destiny of England in his own image. The coup that Edward III orchestrated in 1330 was not merely a physical overthrow of Roger Mortimer. It was the assertion of a king's will. the triumph of a young monarch eager to cast off the shackles of regency and wield the power that was rightfully his. The rebellion, executed with precision and aided by a loyal band of supporters, marked the beginning of a new chapter in England's history, one in which the balance of power between mother and son, once a driving force in the kingdom, had irrevocably shifted. Edward's revolt against Mortimer and his own mother was a decision born of necessity. For years, Isabella had been the de facto ruler of England, wielding significant power through her son's reign, but Mortimer had steadily gained control over the political landscape. The Queen Mother had hoped to retain her power and influence, but in doing so, she had allowed Mortimer to become an increasingly dominant figure. He was no longer just an ally, he was a usurper. An ambitious man whose control over the throne began to overshadow the true king. Edward III, now 18, had been patient. He had bided his time, quietly observing the growing frustration among the English barons and the dissatisfaction with Mortimer's rule. While Isabella had once been a symbol of power, Edward began to understand that the time had come for him to take control of his kingdom and become the ruler he was destined to be. He could no longer remain a passive figurehead. The rebellion itself was swift. Edward, with a small but loyal group of supporters, launched a calculated strike against Mortimer. The king's loyalists, including key members of the nobility, rallied around him, eager to see Mortimer ousted from the political stage. Mortimer, caught off guard by the sudden and coordinated action, was captured and imprisoned. The once mighty ruler, who had manipulated the kingdom from the shadows, now found himself at the mercy of the very young king he had helped place on the throne. The capture of Mortimer was the end of an era. It was not just the removal of a political rival, it was the restoration of Edward III's rightful power. Mortimer's downfall was swift and brutal. He was tried for his crimes and condemned to death, though Isabella, still holding the title of Queen Mother, was powerless to prevent his execution. The man who had once stood at the helm of English politics was now a prisoner of the king he had sought to control. But while Mortimer's life came to a tragic and ignoble end, the consequences of his actions had left an indelible mark on the kingdom. The power vacuum created by Mortimer's removal left Isabella in a precarious position. Once the most powerful woman in England, Isabella now found herself a mother displaced from the political sphere. She had been the driving force behind the coup against Edward II. And she had worked tirelessly to secure the throne for her son. But in the end, it was her own son who had turned against her. Edward III had emerged victorious, but at the cost of their once close relationship. Isabella's fall from power was swift and final. Though she had retained her status as Queen Mother, her influence was significantly diminished. The throne, which she had once controlled through her son, now belonged entirely to Edward III. The young king, having removed Mortimer from the picture, was now free to rule on his own terms. His reign, which had once seemed uncertain, was now firmly in his hands. For Edward, the rebellion was more than just a political victory, it was a personal one. His rebellion against Mortimer had not only secured his power, it had also marked his coming of age as a monarch. Edward III had gone from being a passive figure under the regency to becoming the decisive ruler of England. The young king was no longer under the influence of those who had manipulated him, and he could now pursue his vision for the kingdom without interference. However, the rebellion also had personal consequences for Edward. The rift between him and his mother, Isabella, was permanent. The woman who had once been his protector and political ally was now his political rival. Isabella had fought for her son's throne, but in doing so, she had inadvertently paved the way for her own downfall. The mother who had once been the power behind the throne was now relegated to a distant and powerless position. Edward's relationship with her would never be the same. In the aftermath of Mortimer's removal, Edward III set his sights on strengthening his own rule. The young king quickly began to assert his authority, and his actions signaled a new direction for England. He was determined to restore the power of the crown and establish a reign that would stand the test of time. The early years of his reign, marked by uncertainty and political strife, had now given way to a period of consolidation and strength. One of Edward's first major decisions as an independent ruler was to deal with the question of foreign policy. With his authority firmly established, Edward III turned his attention to the long-standing conflict between England and France. The 100 Years' War, A conflict that would define much of Edward's reign loomed large on the horizon. Edward's claim to the French throne, based on his mother's lineage, would soon become a central issue in his foreign policy. But before he could embark on this ambitious venture, he needed to solidify his position at home. Edward III's rebellion against Mortimer and his mother was not just about reclaiming the throne. It was about securing the future of the English monarchy. The young king understood that the throne could not be held by weakness or indecision. He had to demonstrate strength, resolve, and the ability to lead the kingdom into a new era. By removing Mortimer and asserting his independence, Edward III had laid the foundation for a reign that would be marked by military victories, territorial expansion, and the reassertion of royal authority. In the years following the rebellion, Edward III proved himself to be a capable and ambitious king. His military successes in France, most notably the Battle of Crécy in 1346, established him as one of the most formidable monarchs of his time. The 100 Years' War, which began as a result of his claim to the French throne, would continue for several decades, but it was during this period of military campaigns that Edward cemented his legacy. Edward's reign, however, was not without challenges. Despite his military successes, he faced internal struggles with the nobility, ongoing conflicts in Scotland, and the complexities of governing a kingdom that had been torn apart by years of instability. Yet, through it all, Edward III maintained his grip on power. He was a king who had learned the value of patience and the necessity of decisive action. His rise from the shadows of Mortimer's regency to the throne of England was a testament to his resilience and determination. In the end, the rebellion against Mortimer was a pivotal moment in Edward III's life. It was the moment that transformed him from a young, inexperienced monarch into a powerful ruler. But it was also the moment that altered the course of his relationship with Isabella. The mother and son, once united in their ambitions, were now separated by the very power that they had both fought for. The throne, once a symbol of their shared victory, now stood as a barrier between them, a symbol of the king's independence and the personal cost of royal ambition. The years following the overthrow of Roger Mortimer and the consolidation of power by Edward III marked a turning point in the history of England and Europe. While Edward's rebellion had secured his control over the English throne, it also set the stage for one of the most significant and enduring conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. The conflict, which would span from 1337 to 1453, had deep roots in Edward III's claims to the French throne. And it would come to define much of his reign. As Edward III's power grew in England, so did his sense of ambition. Despite the turbulent years of his early reign, the young king was determined to restore England's prestige, to assert his authority, and to fulfill the promise of his royal heritage. It was during this period that Edward's attention turned to France and the dispute over his claim to the French crown. This claim would not only serve as the catalyst for the 100 Years' War, but it would also shape the political landscape of medieval Europe for generations to come. The roots of the conflict lay in a complex web of familial ties and political maneuvering. Edward III's claim to the French throne was based on his mother, Isabella of France, the daughter of Philip IV of France. When Charles IV, the last male member of the direct Capetian line, died in 1328 without a male heir, the French throne was left vacant. According to French law, a woman could not inherit the throne, which led to the coronation of Philip VI of Valois, a cousin of Charles IV. However, Edward III, as the grandson of Philip IV through Isabella, believed that he had a legitimate claim to the throne of France. At first, Edward had been cautious in asserting his claim, focusing on consolidating his power at home. But as his reign progressed, his ambitions expanded. In 1337, Edward decided to pursue his claim to the French throne openly. He began to issue formal declarations of his right to rule France, and he even refused to recognize Philip VI's legitimacy as king. Edward's actions escalated quickly, and what began as a political dispute soon turned into an outright war for the French crown. The declaration of war was a strategic move, one that would define Edward's reign and shape the destiny of both England and France. The 100 Years' War, as it would come to be known, was a complex and multifaceted conflict, driven not only by Edward's claim to the throne but also by broader issues of territory, power, and economic control, the war would see significant battles, shifting alliances, and moments of both triumph and tragedy. But for Edward III, it was the pursuit of power and the desire to secure his family's legacy that drove him to take this momentous step. The first major engagement of the war came in 1340, when Edward led a naval campaign against the French. The Battle of Sluys, fought off the coast of the Low Countries, was a decisive victory for Edward's fleet. The English victory at Sluys not only secured control over the English Channel but also gave Edward a significant advantage in the early stages of the war. It was a victory that boosted the morale of the English and proved that Edward's claim to the French throne was not a mere political gesture. It was a serious challenge to Philip VI's rule. Edward's military successes, especially his naval triumph at Sluys, were not limited to naval engagements. The war quickly spilled over into the land, with both England and France vying for control of key territories. The English, buoyed by their early victories, began to push deeper into France. Edward III's military leadership during these years would become legendary. He demonstrated a keen strategic mind and a remarkable ability to inspire his troops. Under his leadership, the English military proved to be a formidable force, and Edward III himself gained a reputation as one of the most skilled commanders of his time. However, the war was not without its challenges. Despite the initial successes, Edward faced stiff resistance from the French. Philip VI, though initially caught off guard by Edward's military actions, began to mobilize his own forces. The French king sought to consolidate his position and secure the support of his allies in Europe. The conflict soon expanded, with other nations and factions entering the fray. The English and the French were not alone in this war, as political alliances shifted and realigned in the face of an increasingly complex international conflict. In addition to military engagements, the Hundred Years' War had a profound economic impact on both England and France. The war was, in many ways, a struggle for control of vital trade routes, particularly those in the Flemish territories and the Mediterranean. The English, with their growing naval power, sought to control trade and expand their influence in Europe. Meanwhile, the French were determined to defend their territory and maintain their position as a dominant European power. The war drained the resources of both nations and forced them to rely heavily on their military capabilities to sustain their respective war efforts. For Edward III, the pursuit of the French throne was not just about military conquest, it was a matter of personal legacy. His claim to the French crown was deeply rooted in his sense of royal duty and his desire to honor his mother's lineage. The conflict provided Edward with an opportunity to prove himself as a king capable of securing England's future and expanding its influence. His leadership in the war helped to solidify his position as one of England's most revered monarchs. Yet, as the war continued, Edward III faced growing difficulties. The conflict dragged on, and the English victories began to be tempered by setbacks. Despite his early successes, Edward's military campaigns in France became increasingly difficult, and the long-term costs of the war began to mount. The Hundred Years' War, which had begun with great promise for Edward, would become a prolonged and exhausting struggle, one that would test both his resolve and the endurance of his kingdom. Despite the challenges, Edward III remained determined to press on with his claim to the French throne. The war, which began as a political dispute, had become a symbol of Edward's ambition and his desire to secure England's future. The Hundred Years' War was not merely a military conflict, it was a defining moment in Edward's reign, one that would shape his legacy and determine the fate of both England and France. The years following the beginning of the Hundred Years' War were marked by significant military campaigns and strategic maneuvers. Edward III's leadership in the early stages of the war was nothing short of brilliant, and the English army achieved several critical victories that set the tone for the conflict. These triumphs were not just symbolic, they were crucial in cementing Edward's reputation as a skilled and determined monarch. But while Edward's victories were impressive, the role of his mother, Isabella of France, continued to shape both his reign and his approach to war. As the war dragged on, Isabella's influence on her son would continue to unfold, though in more complex and sometimes subtle ways. The Battle of Crécy, 1346. In 1346, Edward III launched one of his most famous military campaigns, aiming to secure his claim to the French throne through decisive action. He led an army across the English Channel into Normandy, marking the beginning of a series of invasions of French territory. The Battle of Crécy, fought on August 26, 1346, would go down in history as one of the greatest English victories of the war. Crécy was a defining moment in military history, as it demonstrated the effectiveness of English longbowmen and the devastating power of the English military in combat. Edward III's army, composed of infantry, cavalry, and archers, faced off against a much larger French force, led by King Philip VI of France. The French, with their heavy cavalry, were overconfident, and their battle tactics were traditional and outdated in comparison to the English. Edward, a tactical genius, made use of the terrain, positioning his troops in such a way that the French cavalry could not effectively engage the English forces. The battle was a slaughter for the French, and the English emerged victorious. What made Crécy so significant was not just the tactical brilliance of Edward, but the effectiveness of his archers, who proved to be the deciding factor in the battle. The longbow, a weapon that could shoot arrows with devastating accuracy and power, was pivotal in the defeat of the French knights, who had long been considered the backbone of medieval armies. Edward's victory at Crécy was more than just a military triumph. It solidified his position as a capable and powerful king, capable of leading England to victory against one of the most formidable nations in Europe. The English army's success in the battle also provided a clear message to France. Edward III's claim to the throne was not a mere political gesture, but something he was willing to fight for with all his might. The Siege of Calais, 1347. Following the victory at Crécy, Edward III turned his attention to the strategic port of Calais, a critical city on the northern coast of France. Controlling Calais would not only provide the English with a foothold in France but would also disrupt French trade and provide a base for future military operations. In 1347, Edward laid siege to Calais, a city that was heavily fortified and vital to France's economy. The siege was long and grueling, lasting for nearly a year. Despite the hardships, the English were determined to take the city. In the end, after months of relentless siege warfare and the starving of the French defenders, Calais surrendered in August 1347. Edward demanded that 6 of the city's leaders be brought to him in chains, to be executed in a display of triumph. However, at the urging of his queen, Philippa of Hainaut, Edward showed mercy and spared the men, a decision that would become one of his more celebrated acts of chivalry. The capture of Calais was a key turning point in the war. It gave the English a permanent foothold in France and allowed them to control vital trade routes. It also bolstered Edward III's standing as a king who could effectively wage war and achieve his goals. Calais would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, and it became a symbol of England's strength and Edward's military prowess. The role of Isabella, as Edward III's military successes continued to accumulate. His mother, Isabella, continued to play a subtle yet influential role in the background, although she had been sidelined politically after the rebellion of 1330 and the subsequent assertion of her son's rule. Isabella was far from powerless. Her influence remained important, especially in terms of shaping the kingdom's diplomatic relations and maintaining the royal family's reputation. Isabella's role in the Hundred Years' War was not as direct as that of her son, but she was still a significant figure. As the daughter of Philip IV of France, Isabella had a deep understanding of French politics and culture, and her connections within the French court remained strong. Even after her marriage to Edward II, Isabella's understanding of French customs and her relationship with the French royal family provided her son with valuable insight into his enemy. Her diplomacy was instrumental in the early stages of the war, when alliances needed to be solidified, and France needed to be confronted on both the military and political fronts. Moreover, Isabella's influence on Edward III as a mother and advisor could not be understated. While she had lost much of her political power, her relationship with Edward remained strong. The early years of Edward's reign had been shaped by her leadership, and even after her fall from power, she continued to offer guidance when it came to matters of diplomacy, royal etiquette, and military strategy. It was a bond that, despite the political complexities, endured. Isabella's support for her son during these critical military campaigns, though not overt, was felt in subtle ways. It is said that her presence and counsel helped keep Edward grounded during the long months of warfare. While she may not have commanded armies or led sieges, her wisdom and experience as a queen and mother were invaluable to Edward. Especially in the early stages of his reign, the French response and shifting alliances. In the wake of these English victories, France was forced to re-evaluate its position in the war. King Philip VI, though reeling from defeats at Crécy and Calais, continued to pursue military action. However, France's internal situation was growing increasingly difficult. The French economy, already strained by the war, was further weakened by the loss of key territories, and the French nobility began to question the effectiveness of Philip's leadership. As the war continued, alliances between other European powers shifted. The French sought support from the Scots, with whom they had a long-standing alliance, while Edward III courted the support of various other factions, including the Flemish, whose rebellion against French rule gave Edward another avenue to attack France. Edward's ability to navigate these complex diplomatic waters was crucial to his success. He skillfully used his military victories to bolster his political position, forging alliances that helped ensure his kingdom's strength and resources were maximized for the war effort. As the war continued into the 1350s, the English were faced with the challenge of maintaining their military successes while also ensuring the stability of their own kingdom. Edward III's military genius was clear, but the reality of war, its costs, both financial and human, began to take its toll on both England and France. Conclusion: the first few years of the Hundred Years' War were marked by a series of stunning victories for Edward III. From the Battle of Crécy to the Siege of Calais, Edward demonstrated military brilliance that would solidify his place in history. Yet, as the war progressed, the challenges of maintaining such a conflict, both at home and abroad, began to weigh heavily on the English crown. Isabella's role, though less overt than her son's, continued to influence the war and Edward's reign. She may have lost much of her political power, but her counsel and support played an important role in Edward's success. The mother and son, despite the political struggles between them, shared a bond that would remain throughout Edward's reign. As the war progressed, Edward III's vision of England's future began to take shape. The victories of the early years, while significant, were just the beginning of a much larger and more complex conflict. The Hundred Years' War was far from over, and the battles to come would test Edward's resolve and his ability to balance power, diplomacy, and military might. But for now, England stood victorious, and Edward III had proven that he was a king to be reckoned with. As the Hundred Years' War raged on, the tides of battle began to shift. Edward III's reign, bolstered by early victories, would soon face new challenges, both within England and in the broader European context. Yet amidst the political struggles and military campaigns, Isabella of France, once a dominant force in the English court, found herself in the later years of her life living in the shadow of her son's power. Her story, which had been one of ambition, triumph, and eventual decline, was far from over. It was now, in the latter stages of her life, that Isabella's legacy would be reflected on in the court of her son and the kingdom she had once ruled. Isabella's role after the fall of Mortimer. The events of 1330 had irrevocably altered Isabella's political standing. Once a queen regent, Isabella had been pushed aside as her son, Edward III, took full control of the throne. Her political influence, though still significant due to her status as the queen mother, had waned in the face of Edward's growing independence. The downfall of Roger Mortimer, her close ally and the man who had helped her overthrow Edward II, left her in a precarious position. While Mortimer's removal had secured her son's rule, it also meant that her own influence within the kingdom had diminished. Although Edward III was now firmly in charge, Isabella's role was still far from irrelevant. As the mother of the king, she remained an important symbol of royal power, and her advice and presence continued to be valued, though in a more reserved way. Over time, Isabella found herself moving away from the political sphere, focusing more on her family and her own personal affairs. While she had been one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, She was now forced to navigate her new life as a mother with less influence in a kingdom that had increasingly been shaped by her son's authority. A mother in exile, the emotional toll. As time passed and Edward III solidified his reign, Isabella's emotional journey took a different course. The rift between her and her son, which had been created by his rebellion against her and Mortimer, continued to affect their relationship. The once close and powerful bond between mother and son had been shattered by political realities. And Isabella found herself distanced from the court in both a physical and emotional sense. Edward, having grown into a powerful and independent monarch, was no longer the boy who had relied on her guidance. She now observed from the sidelines, often feeling as if her relationship with Edward had been irreparably changed. Though Edward III had removed Mortimer and asserted his power, Isabella remained a significant figure in the English royal family. She was, after all, the mother of the king. And yet, her influence was now more symbolic than practical. Her once vibrant and active role in the kingdom's affairs was now a mere shadow of what it had once been. She lived in the confines of a royal court that had evolved beyond her reach, where her actions and counsel were no longer required. Despite this, Isabella's presence in the court continued to have a subtle impact. As a former Queen of France, she remained connected to the intricate web of European politics. Her ties to her family in France provided a source of leverage for Edward III, especially in the delicate diplomatic negotiations that marked the course of the Hundred Years' War. Isabella's knowledge of French customs and political strategy was an asset, albeit one that she seldom used actively. In many ways, her wisdom became a quiet force behind the scenes, though it was no longer the dominant political influence it once had been. The later years, a figurehead queen. As Isabella entered the later years of her life, she increasingly withdrew from the public political scene. In 1348, she was left largely out of the growing military and diplomatic strategies surrounding the Hundred Years' War. While her son pursued further victories on the battlefield, Isabella spent much of her time managing her own estates and focusing on her family. Her physical and mental health began to decline, and the emotional toll of her loss of power weighed heavily on her. Despite this, Isabella did play a more ceremonial role, attending court functions and receiving visits from foreign dignitaries. While she no longer held real political sway, she was still respected by many as the mother of the king and the former Queen of France. Isabella's presence continued to be a reminder of the strength and ambition she had once embodied. Her life, which had been filled with intrigue, political machinations, and personal loss, was now quiet but dignified. She had experienced the heights of power, only to see it slip away. But her role in history was not to be forgotten. In her final years, Isabella focused on the education and upbringing of her grandchildren. As Edward III's children began to grow, Isabella found solace in the role of grandmother. Her relationship with her grandchildren, particularly her grandsons, was a source of personal fulfillment as she watched the next generation of the royal family begin to take shape. Though she had not achieved all she had hoped for in her later life, Isabella's legacy lived on in her family, especially in her son, Edward III. Isabella's death and legacy. Isabella of France died in 1358, at the age of 63. Having lived a full and tumultuous life, she passed away quietly, far from the power she had once wielded, and from the court that had once revolved around her. Her death marked the end of an era in English history, the end of the reign of one of the most remarkable and politically astute women of her time. Isabella's legacy, though complex, was one of profound impact. As queen consort of Edward II, she had been a figurehead in the ongoing power struggle between England and France. Her determination to overthrow Edward II and her role in placing her son on the throne shaped the future of the English monarchy. Her subsequent loss of power, the rebellion of her son, and her eventual retreat from politics were difficult and painful chapters in her life. And yet, despite the personal toll these events took on her, Isabella's strength of character, political intelligence, and foresight left an indelible mark on history. Edward III's reign, though marked by military successes and political triumphs, was shaped by the foundation that his mother had helped lay. Without Isabella's involvement in the political struggles of the early 14th century, without her determination to secure the throne for her son, Edward III's path to power would have been much more difficult. The events of Isabella's life, From her rise to power as the Queen of England to her fall from grace, continued to influence her son's rule in subtle ways, and the legacy of her actions would be felt throughout the course of the war and beyond. Her relationship with Edward, though strained, was one of the most significant aspects of her life. While the king ultimately chose to distance himself from her, the bond between mother and son was one that could never truly be broken. Isabella of France was not just the mother of Edward III. She was a woman who had lived a life marked by political ambition, personal sacrifice, and an unwavering desire to shape the future of her family and her kingdom. The reign of Edward III, despite the internal struggles of his early years, is often remembered as one of England's most successful periods, particularly in terms of military and territorial expansion. The Hundred Years' War, which began as a dispute over the French throne, would ultimately define much of his reign. Yet, as much as Edward III would shape the future of England, so too would the legacy of his mother, Isabella of France, cast a long shadow over both his rule and English history. The actions Isabella took in the early part of Edward's reign had set in motion events that would impact not only her son's leadership but the very nature of the English monarchy for generations. The queen who shaped history. Isabella's early life, marked by her marriage to Edward II, had set the stage for the dramatic events that would follow. As a daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France, Isabella had been raised in a court filled with political intrigue and maneuvering. Little did she know that her marriage to Edward II, which had been designed to unite the crowns of England and France, would instead place her in the midst of a political storm that would consume both her husband's reign and her own ambitions. Isabella's political acumen and determination were evident from the start. Her frustration with Edward II's inability to lead effectively led her to form an alliance with Roger Mortimer, which would culminate in the deposition of Edward II and the coronation of her son as Edward III. Isabella's role in securing the throne for her son was crucial to the stability of England in the early 14th century. Without her actions, it is doubtful whether Edward III would have come to the throne when he did. But her success in overthrowing Edward II and placing her son in power would come at a steep price, leading to her own diminishing influence in the years that followed. The irony of Isabella's political fall. The irony of Isabella's life was perhaps best encapsulated in the final years of her reign as Queen Mother. Though she had been instrumental in securing Edward III's throne, she would become marginalized by her son once he reached maturity and asserted his authority. Edward's rebellion against his mother's regency in 1330 was the defining moment that shattered the close relationship they once shared. It was an act of defiance that would lead to Isabella's loss of political power and the gradual erosion of her once commanding presence in the court. Yet, while Isabella's role in politics was diminished, her legacy lived on in the kingdom. Her role in the formation of the English monarchy, her ability to influence events, and her strategic mind were integral to Edward III's rise to power. Even after her political influence waned, Isabella's legacy as a queen and a mother remained embedded in the history of England. Her son, Edward III, though he eventually distanced himself from her, owed much of his success to the groundwork she had laid for him in the early years of his reign. Isabella's influence on Edward III's reign. Though their relationship had been strained, Edward III could not escape the impact his mother had on his life. Isabella's actions during the early part of his reign, both politically and emotionally, would shape his approach to leadership. While Edward sought to distance himself from his mother's actions in the coup against Edward II, he could not avoid the influence she had on his character. Her drive for political power, her ambition, and her determination to secure a future for her family were qualities that Edward would come to embody in his own reign. Isabella's legacy was also felt in the diplomatic arena. As the daughter of King Philip IV of France, Isabella had strong familial ties to the French royal family, and these connections would prove useful in the complex political maneuvering of the Hundred Years' War. Although Edward III had established himself as a formidable military leader, his mother's influence could still be felt in the way he handled diplomatic relations. Especially with France, Isabella's knowledge of French politics and her ability to navigate courtly intrigues were valuable assets in Edward's long-standing conflict with the French. The tragedy of Isabella's later life. Isabella's later years. After being sidelined from political power, were marked by a sense of personal and emotional loss, though she had been one of the most powerful women in Europe. The final years of her life were spent in relative obscurity. Her son, now a powerful monarch, ruled without her intervention, and Isabella's place in the royal court was reduced to that of a symbolic figurehead. Isabella's heartache was compounded by her own fading power. The loss of her personal influence was a difficult pill to swallow, especially given her earlier triumphs. Her role in the rebellion that had overthrown her husband had been a victory not just for her but for her son. And yet, this success had ultimately cost her a personal connection with him. The mother who had once been the driving force behind Edward's reign was now a distant figure, watching from the sidelines as her son solidified his own legacy. But even as Isabella retreated from the political spotlight, she found solace in the growing family around her. As her son's children began to reach adulthood, Isabella played a quiet role in their lives, watching as the next generation of the royal family began to take shape. Though she no longer had a direct hand in the fate of the kingdom, her role as a grandmother and mother still held significance within the walls of the royal palace. The final years and death of Isabella. Isabella of France died in 1358. At the age of 63, she passed away in relative obscurity, having lived a life filled with triumph and tragedy, power and loss. The woman who had once been at the center of the English court, who had orchestrated the downfall of a king and secured the throne for her son, was now a figure of the past. Her death marked the end of an era for England, and while her son, Edward III, would continue to rule with distinction, it was clear that Isabella's influence on his life had left a profound mark. Though she may have been forgotten in the later years of her life, Isabella's legacy would endure. Her role in Edward III's ascent to the throne was vital to the stability of England during a turbulent period in the kingdom's history. She was a woman of ambition, intelligence, and resilience, whose actions changed the course of England's future. Without her, the path to the throne for Edward III would have been far more difficult. And while her personal relationship with her son was strained, the impact of her guidance, wisdom, and political maneuvering could still be felt long after her death. Isabella's life, a tale of political intrigue, personal sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to her family, remains a defining chapter in the history of England. As the mother of one of England's greatest kings, she left behind a legacy that continues to be studied and remembered by historians and scholars alike. Despite the challenges she faced, Isabella of France shaped her kingdom, her family, and the course of English history, and her story will forever be a testament to the power and influence of a determined woman. The story of Isabella of France, queen consort, regent, mother, and ultimately, a sidelined royal figure, is a tale of extraordinary ambition, turbulent political shifts, and the complexities of power. In the early 14th century, she had been at the very heart of the English monarchy's struggle for survival and dominance. Through her actions, both bold and calculated, Isabella secured her son, Edward III, a throne that would not have been easily attained had it not been for her efforts. Yet, as with many great figures of history, her legacy was complex and multifaceted, woven into both the glory and the tragedy of her reign. Isabella's political career had begun with a grand vision, uniting England and France in an alliance through her marriage to Edward II. But her dissatisfaction with her husband's reign and her eventual rebellion to secure power for her son would alter the course of history. Her strategy, shaped by necessity, ambition, and foresight, ensured that Edward III took the throne at a young age. Yet the very victory she fought for led to the dissolution of their personal relationship. Edward III, once a boy under her tutelage, matured into a monarch who sought to rule independently, breaking away from his mother's hold. Though her personal influence over England's affairs diminished after Edward's rebellion in 1330, Isabella's legacy lived on in the form of her son's reign. Edward III's military prowess, his claim to the French throne, and his eventual expansion of English territories all had roots in Isabella's determination to place him on the throne. Without her, it is difficult to imagine how Edward III, despite his talents, would have navigated the treacherous political landscape that preceded his reign. Edward's success was in part a reflection of Isabella's earlier accomplishments. Through her involvement in the deposition of Edward II and the orchestration of her son's rise to power, Isabella had laid the foundation for a dynasty that would endure. Her pivotal role in the early years of Edward III's reign, though overshadowed by the events of his rebellion against her, had allowed him the opportunity to pursue his ambitions on the battlefield. Even as her influence waned, Isabella's legacy persisted through the strength and character of her son, whose reign would last for 50 years and become one of the most distinguished in English history. As a queen mother, Isabella's later years were marked by a sense of isolation from the political center of the kingdom. Her personal relationship with her son, once intimate, had been forever altered by the rebellion and her subsequent sidelining. However, Isabella was still a revered figure in England, especially among those who remembered her pivotal role in bringing about the downfall of Edward II and securing the crown for her son. Though she was no longer involved in state affairs, her presence at court and her wisdom continued to be respected. Isabella's life was a testament to the tumultuous nature of medieval politics, where power could be won and lost, and alliances could shift in the blink of an eye. Her reign had been marked by dramatic highs and crushing lows, but the one constant was her devotion to her family, and her willingness to fight for the future of her son. Even in her final years, when she was largely removed from the corridors of power, she remained an important figure, partly because of the legacy she had created, but also because of the love and respect she commanded from her son and her grandchildren. When Isabella passed away in 1358, she left behind a kingdom that was far different from the one she had known in her early days as queen. England, under the rule of Edward III, was on the verge of becoming a dominant power in Europe. The 100 Years' War, though far from over, had already shaped England's military and political identity. Isabella, through her role in Edward's rise and her long-lasting influence on his reign, had contributed to the forging of a legacy that would be remembered for centuries. The significance of Isabella of France's life and career is impossible to overlook. Her personal sacrifices, her political savvy, and her unyielding determination to secure her son's future transformed not only the fate of England but the course of European history. From her early years as a pawn in the political machinations of Europe, to her rise as a powerful queen regent, to her later years as a mother removed from the political world she had once dominated, Isabella's story was one of resilience in the face of adversity. Her place in history is secure, for she was more than just the mother of Edward III. She was a force in her own right, one whose actions forever altered the political landscape of England and France. The war she helped ignite, the 100 Years' War, shaped the future of both nations, leading to shifts in power, territorial changes, and the rise of new monarchies. The death of Isabella marked the end of an era in English history, but her influence would not be easily forgotten. Edward III, who had ultimately sought his own path, never could have ascended to the throne without her, and his reign, though now his own, remained partially built upon the foundations she laid. Isabella's story is a remarkable testament to the role a woman could play in shaping the history of a kingdom. Even in an age where power was predominantly held by men, her final resting place may be in relative obscurity, but the mark she left on history is undeniable. Isabella of France, a queen, a mother, a strategist, and a figure of resilience, remains one of the most complex and influential figures in English history. A woman who knew how to navigate the brutal and unforgiving waters of medieval politics and, in doing so, changed the course of history forever.